How does an ordinary man, timid, bookish, and devout, become the architect of a genocidal machine? Heinrich Himmler did not begin his life as a monster. He was not forged in the heat of war or blessed with charismatic fury. He was a quiet child of a conservative, middle-class German family, a boy more likely to keep a journal than swing a sword. But in the vacuum left behind by a broken empire, Himmler's yearning for order, purity, and purpose made him a perfect vessel for dangerous ideas. Born in 1900 in Munich, Himmler was raised under the stern hand of a devout Catholic schoolmaster. His early years were shaped by discipline, hierarchy, and guilt. As a child, he devoured books about history, military exploits, and ancient Germanic myths. He wasn't athletic or brave, and he carried that private shame for much of his life. Still, he held tightly to dreams of one day serving the fatherland as a hero. The problem was, there was no more fatherland. Germany's defeat in World War I shattered more than a nation. It destroyed the belief system of millions. For Himmler, it was a cosmic betrayal. He had been too young to fight, too small to prove himself. But he grew up watching his country humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, its economy in ruins, its people divided and bitter. Patriotism, once noble, curdled into nationalism. And Himmler, like many others, began searching for someone to blame. He enrolled in agronomy at the Technical University of Munich. While others his age explored freedom and jazz, Himmler retreated further into a world of order and control. He studied the science of breeding, not just animals, but people. He scribbled in his diary about race, discipline, and morality. Ideas of eugenics and racial purity took root in his mind, watered by resentment and the growing appeal of far-right movements. The 1920s were years of chaos in Germany. Hyperinflation turned savings to dust. Paramilitary groups brawled in the streets. Marxists promised revolution, while monarchists longed for the return of the Kaiser. But a new force was rising, a fringe political party led by a fiery Austrian veteran named Adolf Hitler. When Himmler first heard Hitler speak, he felt a kind of deliverance. The speech was not brilliant, but the message, revenge, rebirth, racial destiny, was everything he craved. In 1923, Himmler took part in the failed beer hall putsch, Hitler's early attempt to seize power in Bavaria. It was a debacle. But for Himmler, the arrest of the man he now saw as Germany's savior only deepened his devotion. He did not lead. He did not fight. He followed. And he followed with the precision of a true believer. He officially joined the Nazi Party in 1925, becoming a functionary in its growing paramilitary wing, the Schutzstaffel, better known as the SS. At the time, the SS was a small group of bodyguards tasked with protecting Hitler. But Himmler saw its potential not as mere muscle, but as an elite ideological vanguard. He lobbied for control and was appointed Reichsführer-SS in 1929. He was 29 years old. From the start, he was obsessed with racial purity. He envisioned the SS as more than a military unit. It would be a spiritual order, a community of blood-bound men chosen to reshape Germany's future. He created rituals, genealogical requirements, and codes of conduct. SS men were forbidden from marrying non-Aryans. They were trained to see themselves as guardians of the Nordic race, answerable only to Hitler. Himmler rarely raised his voice. He didn't lead by force. He led by constructing systems, of belief, of classification, of silent obedience. His was not a fiery revolution, but an icy one. His brilliance lay in his ability to make horror seem rational. By the early 1930s, Germany teetered on the edge of collapse. The Great Depression had pushed millions into poverty. The Nazi Party rose quickly, promising order, jobs, and revenge. When Hitler was appointed Chancellor in 1933, Himmler's opportunity exploded. The Reichstag burned, civil liberties vanished, political opponents were arrested en masse, and Himmler? He opened Dachau, the first concentration camp, originally for communists. It was a prototype, an experiment in psychological control as much as physical confinement. It was efficient, silent, and legal. Himmler did not invent violence, but he gave it bureaucracy. He made it scalable. While Hitler ranted and Goebbels stirred the masses, Himmler built the machinery behind the curtain. He was not yet the face of genocide, not yet the monster history remembers. At this stage, Himmler was still a man playing the part of loyal servant, quiet, tireless, terrifying in his competence. He did not question. He organized. And every new position, every new title gave him more reach. Over prisons, over police, over life and death. What set Himmler apart was not his cruelty. It was his conviction that cruelty, when guided by principle, could be sacred. He wrote to his wife about love and duty. In the same breath, he signed orders for executions. He dined with his daughter while overseeing plans for forced sterilization. He believed himself to be a moral man, because his morals were rooted not in compassion, but in a cold vision of racial hierarchy. He did not storm gates or shoot prisoners. He built the gates. He hired the guards. He made sure the trains ran on time. And so, the quiet boy from Munich became one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. By 1934, after the bloody purge of the SA during the Night of the Long Knives, the SS stood alone as Hitler's primary tool of enforcement. And Himmler, unassuming, clerical, fanatical, stood at its helm. This was only the beginning. The true machinery of death had not yet begun to turn, but it had found its engineer. What kind of man builds an empire not on the battlefield, but with ink, files, and silence? By 1935, Heinrich Himmler had become far more than a loyal servant of Hitler. He was the brain behind a system that could calculate death, not as an act of war, but as an act of purification. He did not think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as precise. Himmler's SS expanded like a virus, absorbing police forces, intelligence branches, and administrative offices across Germany. He became chief of all German police in 1936, merging state law enforcement with party ideology. Overnight, order became obedience. The law was no longer blind. It wore black. He created the Gestapo, the secret state police. It did not need to scream to be feared. It relied on whispers, informants, neighbors reporting neighbors. Files multiplied. A word, a look, a misplaced joke could mean arrest, or worse. The Gestapo was not omnipresent. It didn't need to be. People policed themselves. Himmler understood. Fear doesn't require force. It only needs the threat of it. He systematized repression. Everything had its place. Every file, every suspect, every punishment. There were forms to fill, boxes to check, categories to assign. The machinery of terror became a spreadsheet. SS ideology seeped into every layer of society. Universities, schools, courts, churches, none were untouched. Himmler sent agents to root out the un-German. Professors were dismissed. Priests were watched. Art was censored. He created the Race and Settlement Office to oversee who could marry whom. Blood tests, ancestry charts, racial profiles, all to protect the myth of Aryan purity. And always, behind the bureaucracy, the camps grew. Not yet killing centers, but labor camps, detention sites, Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen. They multiplied under Himmler's guidance. Each one a model of discipline, dehumanization, and quiet horror. The SS became a parallel state. It had its own economy, businesses that used forced labor from prisoners, its own judiciary, its own security. Himmler even had ambitions for it to become a racial aristocracy for centuries to come. He spoke not of conquest but of cleansing, not of war but of health. He believed he was saving Europe, from Jews, from Bolsheviks, from decay. He wrapped hate in the language of hygiene. Every step, each file, each law, each camp, was a brick in a cathedral of control. Even within the SS, Himmler demanded ideological purity. He created the SS Leadership School to indoctrinate commanders. He personally reviewed family backgrounds for new recruits. He wanted not soldiers, but missionaries of race. What made Himmler terrifying was not rage, but calm. He never struck fear like Hitler. He did not captivate crowds like Goebbels. But in meetings, behind desks, over dinner tables, he decided fates with the stroke of a pen. In 1938, during the annexation of Austria, the SS marched in not as warriors, but as managers. They arrested thousands, cataloged property, installed networks. Austria was not conquered. It was absorbed. Then came Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Synagogues burned. Jewish homes and businesses were destroyed. Himmler was not the instigator, but he ensured it became a data point, a logistical exercise, a dry run for something larger. And always he framed it as law, as duty, as defense. The SS oath was not to Germany, it was to Hitler. But in practice, it was to Himmler's system. Cold, efficient, relentless. By the time war began in 1939, Himmler had already built the tools. The question was no longer if they would be used, but how far. And in that silent march toward annihilation, he was not just a cog, he was the watchmaker. If mass murder can be engineered with calm logic, what happens to our definition of evil? The invasion of Poland in 1939 marked a turning point, not just for Europe, but for Himmler. What had once been ideology now became action, and what had once been theory now took on physical form. The war gave Himmler what he had long prepared for, a canvas vast enough to test his vision of racial redesign. Germany's swift victory in Poland brought more than territory. It brought millions of unwanted people, Jews, Slavs, Romani, and political dissidents. To Himmler, they were not citizens. They were variables in an equation, problems to solve. He immediately dispatched SS death squads, Einsatzgruppen, to follow the Wehrmacht and secure occupied regions. But security in this context meant execution. Mass shootings, entire villages extinguished in forests and ravines. These were not battles. These were not soldiers. These were families, children, elders. And each day, the SS recorded the number of those killed, as if tracking inventory. But Himmler saw even this as inefficient. Bullets were expensive. Morale among executioners was unstable. Some soldiers wept, some vomited, some cracked. So Himmler looked for a cleaner solution, a process that would remove emotion and replace it with logistics. In 1941, he stood near a mass grave outside Minsk. The smell of blood and soil, the mechanical sound of rifles, and he, unshaken, told his aides that Germany needed a better way. That better way became the final solution. Heinrich Himmler didn't design Auschwitz, but he commissioned it. He didn't turn the valves of Zyklon B, but he approved the budgets, signed the memos, assigned the staff. Under his command, the SS transformed killing into infrastructure. Rail lines were redrawn, deportation schedules drafted, architecture adapted to the purpose of annihilation. Gas chambers and crematoria were built not in haste, but with calculation. Everything optimized: intake, separation, extermination, disposal. Auschwitz, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. The names now echo as symbols of hell. But to Himmler, they were logistical hubs. He referred to the victims as units, as figures in reports. He believed this was mercy, not to the dead, but to the killers. To carry out such tasks and remain decent, he said, that is what makes us noble. He gave speeches to SS leaders extolling their moral fortitude. He did not demand joy in the killing, but endurance. He told them they were performing a necessary duty, that history would never understand them, but that one day their sacrifice would be honored. In his twisted worldview, Himmler saw genocide as an act of hygiene, a cruel operation required to preserve the body of Europe. What made it more horrifying was how ordinary it all seemed. Office workers compiled lists, engineers calculated airflow in gas chambers, guards filed reports, trains ran on time. At no point did the system require rage. It required order. There is a photograph of Himmler in civilian clothes, feeding a deer on his estate. Another shows him cradling a child. He wrote tender letters to his wife, sent birthday cards to his daughter. And yet every day, he oversaw a network designed to erase entire peoples. This is the paradox of Himmler, the man who built a death machine not with fire and fury, but with folders and files, with rituals and ranks, with a soft voice and a cold heart. By 1943, the final solution was in full operation. Millions had already perished, yet Himmler remained convinced he was on the side of righteousness. He banned photos of executions, not out of shame, but to protect morale. He encouraged silence, not out of guilt, but to preserve the purity of the SS. In one of his most chilling speeches, he told officers, "We shall never speak of this. It is a page of glory which has never been written and shall never be written." But history did write it, and the ink was blood. What Himmler created was not only a genocide, it was a system in which evil could be normalized, rationalized, and distributed across thousands of hands, none of whom felt fully responsible. He made murder bureaucratic. And once murder becomes procedure, who dares to question it? When a man begins to believe he is the architect of destiny, how long before he loses sight of his own humanity? By 1943, Heinrich Himmler stood near the peak of his power. He had risen from a functionary to one of the most feared and respected men in Nazi Germany, second only to Hitler in influence. But beneath the polished boots and meticulous files, something darker stirred. The war that had once seemed destined for German triumph was shifting. Cracks appeared in the myth, and the man who had so carefully constructed a machine of death began to believe he could shape the future itself. Himmler no longer viewed himself merely as a servant. He saw himself as the guardian of a new civilization. Not just the enforcer of Hitler's will, but the shaper of an eternal Reich. A racially pure empire that would endure for 1,000 years. He became obsessed with legacy. SS officers were no longer just elite soldiers. They were groomed as aristocrats of the future, fathers of a master race. Himmler poured resources into the Lebensborn program, an effort to breed racially pure children from selected women and SS men. He collected ancestral records, scrutinized skull shapes, and dreamed of entire settlements populated by Aryans raised under SS principles. Meanwhile, the world outside was burning. In the east, the Soviet counteroffensives gained momentum. The Battle of Stalingrad had shattered the illusion of invincibility. In the west, Allied bombers darkened the skies over German cities. Yet Himmler remained strangely untouched by urgency. While tanks burned and soldiers froze, he inspected archaeological digs in occupied Poland, searching for evidence of ancient Germanic tribes. He believed history was a tool, one that could be rewritten, reshaped, repurposed to serve his vision. And yet, even as his fantasies grew, his grip on reality tightened in other areas. The machinery of the Holocaust ran at full capacity. Deportations increased. More camps were built. Himmler spoke less of extermination in public, but his memos remained precise. His orders, coded and cold, ensured the killing never paused. But something else had begun to change. Inside the SS, cracks formed. Commanders questioned the sustainability of the mass killings. Some became numb. Others grew disillusioned. Reports surfaced of officers suffering mental collapse, not out of guilt, but from the sheer psychic weight of systemic murder. And so Himmler doubled down. He gave speeches about duty, about moral strength, about the sacred task of saving Europe. He created a narrative where suffering was proof of righteousness, where the blood on their hands was a badge of honor. By 1944, he controlled not only the SS and police, but also the entire concentration camp system, much of Germany's internal security, and several industrial operations using slave labor. He was no longer operating in the shadows. He had become a public figure, a state within the state, and with power came delusion. Himmler began to imagine himself as a statesman. He spoke of diplomacy, of negotiating peace. He envisioned a post-Hitler Germany, one where he, not Göring or Goebbels, would lead a rational, orderly Reich. He cultivated contacts through back channels. He sent feelers to the Allies. Secretly, he began exploring the possibility of separate peace agreements with the West, offering Jewish prisoners as bargaining chips. This was treason, but in his mind, it was strategy. The man who once swore eternal loyalty to Hitler now saw himself as the savior of Germany, from chaos, from collapse, even from Hitler himself. Yet he never abandoned the killing. Even in his most diplomatic phase, Himmler accelerated deportations from Hungary. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were sent to Auschwitz in just a few weeks. The trains kept running. The chimneys kept burning. This was not contradiction. This was consistency. In Himmler's world, compromise did not mean mercy. It meant efficiency. Peace did not mean justice. It meant order. But the walls were closing in. The July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler in 1944 sent shockwaves through the Reich. Himmler, though not involved, seized the moment to consolidate power. He demanded loyalty oaths. He purged potential rivals. He expanded surveillance. Paranoia wrapped itself around him. He placed mystics and astrologers on his staff. He consulted horoscopes before making key decisions. He clung to symbols, to rituals, to the imagined destiny of the SS as guardians of Europe's soul. Outside, the Red Army advanced. American tanks rolled through France. German cities crumbled. And still, Himmler believed. He believed he could outlast Hitler. He believed the SS could rebuild. He believed history would vindicate him. The man who once filed reports in ink now scribbled delusions in his diary. By early 1945, his speeches took on a surreal tone, calling on boys to fight to the last man, promising miracles from secret weapons. He spoke to ghosts. He gave orders no one followed. He was no longer feared. He was no longer obeyed, but he refused to see it. The death camps still functioned, but the Reich was dying. And Heinrich Himmler, the quiet boy who once dreamed of order, stood surrounded by ruins of his own making. What happens when a man believes so deeply in his own purity, he can no longer see the ash falling from the sky? Can a man who orchestrated millions of deaths truly believe he deserves to walk away free? By April 1945, the world Heinrich Himmler had helped design was collapsing. Berlin was encircled. Hitler hid in his bunker, surrounded by delusion and despair. Allied forces closed in from west and east, and smoke from German cities choked the skies. Yet amid the ruins of the Reich, Himmler still believed he could find a way out. Not justice, not redemption, escape. He was no longer the unshakable architect of order. Gone was the polished SS uniform, the cold command. In its place, a man in disguise, shuffling across war-torn roads in civilian clothes, carrying false papers under a fake name. Heinrich Himmler. But before the mask came the betrayal. In Hitler's final days, Himmler made his move. Without his Führer's knowledge, he initiated secret contacts with the Western Allies. Through Swedish intermediaries, he offered a deal. Germany would surrender in the West, keep fighting in the East, and perhaps, just perhaps, he could help govern the new post-war order. It was delusional. Himmler believed that the very men he had targeted for extermination, the British, the Americans, the Jews, might now see him as a useful ally against communism. When Hitler learned of Himmler's treachery, even in the twilight of madness, he acted with clarity. He stripped Himmler of all titles, declared him a traitor, ordered his arrest. The man who had built an empire of control was now an outcast in the chaos he helped create. As Nazi Germany fell, Himmler vanished into its wreckage. He wandered through bombed-out towns and shattered villages, slipping past checkpoints, hiding in barns. He was no longer a titan. He was a fugitive, captured by British forces near Bremervörde on May 21, 1945. He still tried to cling to identity. "I am Heinrich Himmler," he declared. He believed he would be treated with the dignity of a statesman. Instead, he was searched, stripped, interrogated. And when he realized there would be no trial on his terms, no negotiation, no legacy, he bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule. His death was not cinematic. No final words, no confession, no reckoning, just a twitch, a convulsion, then silence. The man responsible for industrialized genocide died alone in a British detention room, his last act not one of courage, but of cowardice. No trial, no Nuremberg, no history's witness. Only a hole in the ground, his body buried in secret, nameless and unmarked. The precise location still unknown. And yet, the real tragedy is not that Himmler escaped judgment. It's that he never believed he deserved it. He saw himself not as a villain, but as a patriot. Not a butcher, but a guardian. He spoke often of duty, sacrifice, morality. He cried at funerals. He loved dogs. He quoted scripture. But he never looked into the abyss he helped dig. Even in his final months, Himmler showed no sign of remorse. No recognition of the horror. No apology. Only concern for his own future. Only fear of being forgotten. He died as he lived, in control of the narrative, avoiding confrontation with truth. And in that, perhaps, lies the most haunting truth of all. That the man who engineered a system where millions vanished into smoke could himself disappear without a trace. Not because justice failed, but because evil, when clothed in bureaucracy and belief, can be hard to recognize even as it swallows the world. So history remembers not the man who died behind barbed wire, but the millions who never had the chance to speak. If a system built on fear and silence can outlive its creator, how do we ensure it never rises again? Himmler died without trial, without reckoning, without truth. But the world he engineered did not vanish with his heartbeat. It left behind ashes, files, names carved into nothingness. Camps that stood in silence for decades before the world had the courage to look. And when we did look, we saw more than barbed wire and gas chambers. We saw how easily the ordinary could be weaponized, how evil could dress in uniforms, speak in policy, and flourish through compliance. Himmler's system was not sustained by monsters. It thrived because enough people looked away, because rules made it feel official, because language made it feel necessary, because fear taught people to follow rather than question. This is not just a story of one man. It is a story of the machinery he built, and the human choices that fed it. He believed in obedience, in structure, in purity. He believed those things gave him moral clarity, but what they gave him was the permission to turn people into numbers, into problems, into targets. The Holocaust was not a single eruption of hatred. It was a process, incremental, administrative, deliberate. And Himmler was its steward, not because he screamed loudest, but because he whispered into systems. And so we must ask ourselves, where are the whispers now? In every age, there are those who believe order is more important than justice, that security is worth the cost of someone else's dignity, that us and them must be preserved, even at the expense of truth. Today, when we see walls rising, when we hear chants of exclusion, when bureaucracy turns away the desperate, when silence becomes policy, we must remember. History does not repeat, it warns. The truest legacy of Heinrich Himmler is not the horror he caused, but the ease with which he caused it. Because he was not born evil. He simply believed that what he was doing made sense. And that is why his story must be told. Not to horrify us, but to awaken us. To remind us that no matter how civilized the world becomes, we are never far from the edge. Because it was not fire that destroyed millions. It was paperwork. It was indifference. It was silence. The final act of justice is not his trial. It is our memory. So let us remember not his name, but every name he tried to erase. Let us remember not his vision, but the futures he stole. Let us remember, so we never again build a world where someone like him could quietly thrive. And let us remember, because the moment we forget, it begins again.